Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was a South African anti-apartheid activist who served as the first president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. He was the country's first black head of state and the first elected in a fully representative democratic election. His government focused on dismantling the legacy of apartheid by fostering racial reconciliation. Ideologically an African nationalist and socialist, he served as the president of the African National Congress Party from 1991 to 1997. A Xhosa, Mandela was born into the Thembu royal family in Mvezo, Union of South Africa. He studied law at the University of Fort Hare and the University of Witwatersrand before working as a lawyer in Johannesburg. There he became involved in anti-colonial and African nationalist politics, joining the ANC in 1943 and co-founding its Youth League in 1944. After the National Party's white-only government established apartheid, a system of racial segregation that privileged whites, Mandela and the ANC committed themselves to its overthrow. He was appointed president of the ANC's Transvaal branch, rising to prominence for his involvement in the 1952 Defiance Campaign and the 1955 Congress of the People. He was repeatedly arrested for seditious activities and was unsuccessfully prosecuted in the 1956 treason trial. Influenced by Marxism, he secretly joined the banned South African Communist Party. Although initially committed to nonviolent protest, in association with the SACP he co-founded the militant Umkhonto we Sizwe in 1961 and led a sabotage campaign against the government. He was arrested and imprisoned in 1962, and, following the Rivonia trial, was sentenced to life imprisonment for conspiring to overthrow the state. Mandela served 27 years in prison, split between Robben Island, Pollsmoor Prison, and Victor Verster Prison. Amid growing domestic and international pressure and fears of racial civil war, President F.W. de Klerk released him in 1990. Mandela and de Klerk led efforts to negotiate an end to apartheid, which resulted in the 1994 multiracial general election in which Mandela led the ANC to victory and became president. Leading a broad coalition government which promulgated a new constitution, Mandela emphasized reconciliation between the country's racial groups and created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate past human rights abuses. Economically, his administration retained its predecessor's liberal framework despite his own socialist beliefs, also introducing measures to encourage land reform, combat poverty, and expand healthcare services. Internationally, Mandela acted as mediator in the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing trial and served as Secretary General of the Non-Aligned Movement from 1998 to 1999. He declined a second presidential term and was succeeded by his deputy, Thabo Mbeki. Mandela became an elder statesman and focused on combating poverty and HIV/AIDS through the charitable Nelson Mandela Foundation. Mandela was a controversial figure for much of his life. Although critics on the right denounced him as a communist terrorist and those on the far left deemed him too eager to negotiate and reconcile with apartheid's supporters, he gained international acclaim for his activism. Globally regarded as an icon of democracy and social justice, he received more than 250 honors, including the Nobel Peace Prize. He is held in deep respect within South Africa, where he is often referred to by his Thembu clan name, Madaba, and described as the father of the nation. Life. Early life. Childhood, 1918–1934. Clark Ebury, Heald Town, and Fort Hare, 1934–1940. Arriving in Johannesburg, 1941–1943. Revolutionary activity. Law studies and the ANC Youth League, 1943–1949. Defiance Campaign and Transvaal ANC Presidency, 1950–1954. Congress of the People and the Treason Trial, 1955–1961. MK, the SACP, An African Tour, 1961–62. Imprisonment. Arrest and Rivonia Trial, 1962–1964. Robben Island, 1964–1982. Pollsmoor Prison, 1982–1988. Victor Verster Prison and Release, 1988–1990. End of Apartheid. Early Negotiations, 1990–91. Codesa Talks, 1991–92. General Election, 1994. Presidency of South Africa, 1994–1999. The newly elected National Assembly's first act was to formally elect Mandela as South Africa's first black chief executive. His inauguration took place in Pretoria on May 10, 1994, televised to 1 billion viewers globally. The event was attended by 4,000 guests, including world leaders from a wide range of geographic and ideological backgrounds. Mandela headed a government of national unity dominated by the ANC, which had no experience of governing by itself but containing representatives from the National Party and Inkatha. Under the interim constitution, Inkatha and the National Party were entitled to seats in the government by virtue of winning at least 20 seats. In keeping with earlier agreements, both de Klerk and Thabo Mbeki were given the position of deputy president. Although Mbeki had not been his first choice for the job, Mandela grew to rely heavily on him throughout his presidency, allowing him to shape policy details. Moving into the presidential office at Tunhuis in Cape Town, Mandela allowed de Klerk to retain the presidential residence in the Groote Schuur estate, instead settling into the nearby Westbrook Manor, which he renamed Genadendal, meaning Valley of Mercy in Afrikaans. Retaining his Houghton home, he also had a house built in his home village of Qunu, which he visited regularly, walking around the area, meeting with locals, and judging tribal disputes. Aged 76, he faced various ailments, and although exhibiting continued energy, he felt isolated and lonely. He often entertained celebrities, such as Michael Jackson, Whoopi Goldberg, and the Spice Girls, and befriended ultra-rich businessmen, like Harry Oppenheimer of Anglo American. He also met with Queen Elizabeth II on her March 1995 state visit to South Africa, which earned him strong criticism from ANC anti-capitalists. Despite his opulent surroundings, Mandela lived simply, donating a third of his R$552,000 annual income to the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, which he had founded in 1995. Although dismantling press censorship, speaking out in favor of freedom of the press and befriending many journalists, Mandela was critical of much of the country's media, noting that it was overwhelmingly owned and run by middle-class whites and believing that it focused too heavily on scaremongering about crime. In December 1994, Mandela published Long Walk to Freedom, an autobiography based around a manuscript he had written in prison, augmented by interviews conducted with American journalist Richard Stengel. In late 1994, he attended the 49th conference of the ANC in Bloemfontein, at which a more militant national executive was elected, among them Winnie Mandela. Although she expressed an interest in reconciling, Nelson initiated divorce proceedings in August 1995. By 1995, he had entered into a relationship with Graca Machel, a Mozambican political activist 27 years his junior who was the widow of former President Samora Machel. They had first met in July 1990 when she was still in mourning, but their friendship grew into a partnership, with Machel accompanying him on many of his foreign visits. She turned down Mandela's first marriage proposal, wanting to retain some independence and dividing her time between Mozambique and Johannesburg. National reconciliation. Domestic programs. Foreign affairs. Withdrawing from politics. Retirement. Continued activism and philanthropy, 1999–2004. Retiring from retirement, 2004-2013. Illness and death, 2011-2013. Political ideology. Mandela identified as both an African nationalist, an ideological position he held since joining the ANC, and as a socialist. He was a practical politician, rather than an intellectual scholar or political theorist. According to biographer Tom Lodge, for Mandela, politics has always been primarily about enacting stories, about making narratives, primarily about morally exemplary conduct, and only secondarily about ideological vision, more about means rather than ends. The historian Sabelo J. Ndlovukatsini described Mandela as a liberal African nationalist decolonial humanist, while political analyst Raymond Suttner cautioned against labeling Mandela a liberal and stated that Mandela displayed a hybrid socio-political makeup. Mandela adopted some of his political ideas from other thinkers, among them Indian independence leaders like Gandhi and Nehru, African American civil rights activists, and African nationalists like Nkrumah, and applied them to the South African situation. At the same time, he rejected other aspects of their thought, such as the anti-white sentiment of many African nationalists. In doing so, he synthesized both countercultural and hegemonic views, for instance by drawing upon ideas from the then dominant Afrikaner nationalism in promoting his anti-apartheid vision. His political development was strongly influenced by his legal training and practice, in particular his hope to achieve change not through violence but through legal revolution. Over the course of his life, he began by advocating a path of nonviolence, later embracing violence, and then adopting a nonviolent approach to negotiation and reconciliation. When endorsing violence, he did so because he saw no alternative, and was always pragmatic about it, perceiving it as a means to get his opponent to the negotiating table. He sought to target symbols of white supremacy and racist oppression rather than white people as individuals, and was anxious not to inaugurate a race war in South Africa. This willingness to use violence distinguishes Mandela from the ideology of Gandhism, with which some commentators have sought to associate him. Democracy. Although he presented himself in an autocratic manner in several speeches, Mandela was a devout believer in democracy and abided by majority decisions even when deeply disagreeing with them. He had exhibited a commitment to the values of democracy and human rights since at least the 1960s. He held a conviction that inclusivity, accountability, and freedom of speech were the fundamentals of democracy, and was driven by a belief in natural and human rights. Suttner argued that there were two modes of leadership that Mandela adopted. On one side he adhered to ideas about collective leadership, although on the other believed that there were scenarios in which a leader had to be decisive and act without consultation to achieve a particular objective. According to Lodge, Mandela's political thought reflected tensions between his support for liberal democracy and pre-colonial African forms of consensus decision-making. He was an admirer of British-style parliamentary democracy, stating that "I regard the British Parliament as the most democratic institution in the world, and the independence and impartiality of its judiciary never fail to arouse my admiration." In this he has been described as being committed to the Euro-North American modernist project of emancipation, something which distinguishes him from other African nationalist and socialist leaders like Nyerere, who were concerned about embracing styles of democratic governance that were Western, rather than African, in origin. Mandela nevertheless also expressed admiration for what he deemed to be indigenous forms of democracy, describing Xhosa traditional society's mode of governance as democracy in its purest form. He also spoke of an influential African ethical tenet, Ubuntu, which is a Nguni term meaning a person is a person through other persons, or I am because we are. Socialism and Marxism. Mandela advocated the ultimate establishment of a classless society, with Sampson describing him as being openly opposed to capitalism, private land ownership, and the power of big money. Mandela was influenced by Marxism, and during the revolution he advocated scientific socialism. He denied being a communist at the treason trial, and maintained this stance both when later talking to journalists, and in his autobiography, where he outlined that the cooperation with the SACP was pragmatic, asking rhetorically, who is to say that we were not using them? According to the sociologist Craig Sutien, sympathetic as Mandela was to socialism, a communist he was not. Conversely, the biographer David Jones Smith stated that Mandela embraced communism and communists in the late 1950s and early 1960s, while the historian Stephen Ellis commented that Mandela had assimilated much of the Marxist-Leninist ideology by 1960. Ellis also found evidence that Mandela had been an active member of the South African Communist Party during the late 1950s and early 1960s, something that was confirmed after his death by both the ANC and the SACP, the latter of which claimed that he was not only a member of the party, but also served on its Central Committee. His membership had been hidden by the ANC, aware that knowledge of Mandela's former SACP involvement might have been detrimental to his attempts to attract support from Western countries. Mandela's view of these Western governments differed from those of Marxist-Leninists, for he did not believe that they were anti-democratic or reactionary and remained committed to democratic systems of governance. The 1955 Freedom Charter, which Mandela had helped create, called for the nationalization of banks, gold mines, and land, to ensure equal distribution of wealth. Despite these beliefs, Mandela initiated a program of privatization during his presidency in line with trends in other countries of the time. It has been repeatedly suggested that Mandela would have preferred to develop a social democratic economy in South Africa, but that this was not feasible as a result of the international political and economic situation during the early 1990s. This decision was in part influenced by the fall of the socialist states in the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc during the early 1990s. Personality and personal life. Mandela was widely considered a charismatic leader, described by biographer Mary Benson as a born mass leader who could not help magnetizing people. He was highly image-conscious and throughout his life always sought out fine quality clothes, with many commentators believing that he carried himself in a regal manner. His aristocratic heritage was repeatedly emphasized by supporters, thus contributing to his charismatic power. While living in Johannesburg in the 1950s, he cultivated the image of the African gentleman, having the pressed clothes, correct manners, and modulated public speech associated with such a position. In doing so, Lodge argued that Mandela became one of the first media politicians, embodying a glamour and a style that projected visually a brave new African world of modernity and freedom. Mandela was known to change his clothes several times a day, and he became so associated with highly colored batik shirts after assuming the presidency that they came to be known as Madiba shirts. For political scientists Betty Glatt and Robert Blanton, Mandela was an exceptionally intelligent, shrewd, and loyal leader. His official biographer, Anthony Sampson, commented that he was a master of imagery and performance, excelling at presenting himself well in press photographs and producing sound bites. His public speeches were presented in a formal, stiff manner, and often consisted of cliched set phrases. He typically spoke slowly, and carefully chose his words. Although he was not considered a great orator, his speeches conveyed his personal commitment, charm, and humor. Mandela was a private person who often concealed his emotions and confided in very few people. Privately, he lived an austere life, refusing to drink alcohol or smoke, and even as president made his own bed. Renowned for his mischievous sense of humor, he was known for being both stubborn and loyal, and at times exhibited a quick temper. He was typically friendly and welcoming, and appeared relaxed in conversation with everyone, including his opponents. A self-described Anglophile, he claimed to have lived by the trappings of British style and manners. Constantly polite and courteous, he was attentive to all, irrespective of their age or status, and often talked to children or servants. He was known for his ability to find common ground with very different communities. In later life, he always looked for the best in people, even defending political opponents to his allies, who sometimes thought him too trusting of others. He was fond of Indian cuisine, and had a lifelong interest in archaeology and boxing. He was raised in the Methodist denomination of Christianity. The Methodist Church of Southern Africa claimed that he retained his allegiance to them throughout his life. On analyzing Mandela's writings, the theologian Dion Forster described him as a Christian humanist, although added that his thought relied to a greater extent on the Southern African concept of Ubuntu than on Christian theology. According to Sampson, Mandela never had a strong religious faith. However, while Elliot Burmer stated that Mandela's religious belief was never robust. Mandela was very self-conscious about being a man and regularly made references to manhood. He was heterosexual, and biographer Fatima Mir said that he was easily tempted by women. Another biographer, Martin Meredith, characterized him as being by nature a romantic, highlighting that he had relationships with various women. Mandela was married 3 times, fathered 6 children, and had 17 grandchildren and at least 17 great-grandchildren. He could be stern and demanding of his children, although he was more affectionate with his grandchildren. His first marriage was to Evelyn Ntoko Mays in October 1944. They divorced in March 1958 under the multiple strains of his adultery and constant absences, devotion to revolutionary agitation, and the fact that she was a Jehovah's Witness, a religion requiring political neutrality. Mandela's second wife was the social worker Winnie Madikizela Mandela, whom he married in June 1958. They divorced in March 1996. Mandela married his third wife, Graca Machel, on his 80th birthday in July 1998. Reception and legacy. By the time of his death, within South Africa Mandela was widely considered both the father of the nation and the founding father of democracy. Outside of South Africa, he was a global icon, with the scholar of South African studies Rita Barnard describing him as one of the most revered figures of our time. One biographer considered him a modern democratic hero. Some have portrayed Mandela in messianic terms, in contrast to his own statement that I was not a messiah, but an ordinary man who had become a leader because of extraordinary circumstances. He is often cited alongside Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. as one of the 20th century's exemplary anti-racist and anti-colonial leaders. Burmer described him as a totem of the totemic values of our age, toleration and liberal democracy, and a universal symbol of social justice. Mandela's international fame emerged during his incarceration in the 1980s, when he became the world's most famous political prisoner, a symbol of the anti-apartheid cause, and an icon for millions who embraced the ideal of human equality. In 1986, Mandela's biographer characterized him as the embodiment of the struggle for liberation in South Africa. Meredith stated that in becoming a potent symbol of resistance to apartheid during the 1980s, he had gained mythical status internationally. Sampson commented that even during his life, this myth had become so powerful that it blurs the realities, converting Mandela into a secular saint. Within a decade of the end of his presidency, Mandela's era was widely thought of as a golden age of hope and harmony, with much nostalgia being expressed for it. His name was often invoked by those criticizing his successors like Mbeki and Zuma. Across the world, Mandela earned international acclaim for his activism in overcoming apartheid and fostering racial reconciliation, coming to be viewed as a moral authority with a great concern for truth. Mandela's iconic status has been blamed for concealing the complexities of his life. Mandela generated controversy throughout his career as an activist and politician, having detractors on both the right and the radical left. During the 1980s, Mandela was widely labeled a terrorist by prominent political figures in the Western world for his embrace of political violence. According to Thatcher, for instance, the ANC was a typical terrorist organization. The U.S. government's State and Defense Departments officially designated the ANC as a terrorist organization, resulting in Mandela remaining on their terrorism watch list until 2008. On the left, some voices in the ANC, among them Frank B. Wilderson III, accused him of selling out for agreeing to enter negotiations with the apartheid government and for not implementing the reforms of the Freedom Charter during his presidency. According to Barnard, there is also a sense in which his chiefly bearing and mode of conduct, the very respect and authority he accrued in representing his nation in his own person, went against the spirit of democracy, and concerns were similarly expressed that he placed his own status and celebrity above the transformation of his country. His government would be criticized for its failure to deal with both the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the high levels of poverty in South Africa. Mandela was also criticized for his friendship with political leaders such as Castro, Gaddafi, and Suharto, deemed dictators by critics, as well as his refusal to condemn their government's human rights violations. Orders, decorations, monuments, and honors. Over the course of his life, Mandela was given over 250 awards, accolades, prizes, honorary degrees and citizenships in recognition of his political achievements. Among his awards were the Nobel Peace Prize, the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Soviet Union's Lenin Peace Prize, and the Libyan Al-Gaddafi International Prize for Human Rights. In 1990, India awarded him the Bharat Ratna, and in 1992 Pakistan gave him their Nishan-e-Pakistan. The same year, he was awarded the Ataturk Peace Award by Turkey. He at first refused the award, citing human rights violations committed by Turkey at the time, but later accepted the award in 1999. He was given the Fulbright Prize for International Understanding by the Fulbright Association in 1993. He was appointed to the Order of Isabella the Catholic and the Order of Canada, and was the first living person to be made an honorary Canadian citizen. Queen Elizabeth II appointed him as a Bailiff Grand Cross of the Order of St. John and granted him membership in the Order of Merit. In 2004, Johannesburg granted Mandela the freedom of the city, and in 2008 a Mandela statue was unveiled at the spot where Mandela was released from prison. On the Day of Reconciliation 2013, a bronze statue of Mandela was unveiled at Pretoria's Union Buildings. In November 2009, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed Mandela's birthday, July 18, as Mandela Day, marking his contribution to the anti-apartheid struggle. It called on individuals to donate 67 minutes to doing something for others, commemorating the 67 years that Mandela had been a part of the movement. In 2015, the Union General Assembly named the amended Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners as the Mandela Rules to honor his legacy. Biographies and popular media. The first biography of Mandela was authored by Mary Benson, based on brief interviews with him that she had conducted in the 1960s. Two authorized biographies were later produced by friends of Mandela. The first was Fatima Meer's Higher Than Hope, which was heavily influenced by Winnie and thus placed great emphasis on Mandela's family. The second was Anthony Sampson's Mandela, published in 1999. Other biographies included Martin Meredith's Mandela, first published in 1997, and Tom Lodge's Mandela, brought out in 2006. Since the late 1980s, Mandela's image began to appear on a proliferation of items, among them photographs, paintings, drawings, statues, public murals, buttons, t-shirts, refrigerator magnets, and more, items that have been characterized as Mandela kitsch. In the 1980s he was the subject of several songs, such as the specials Free Nelson Mandela, Hugh Masekela's Bring Him Back Home, and Johnny Clegg's Asimbananga, which helped to bring awareness of his imprisonment to an international audience. Following his death, many internet memes appeared featuring images of Mandela with his inspirational quotes superimposed onto them. Mandela has also been depicted in films on multiple occasions. Some of these, such as the 2013 feature film Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom, the 2017 miniseries Madaba and the 1996 documentary Mandela, have focused on covering his adult life in entirety or until his inaugural as president. Others, such as the 2009 feature film Invictus and the 2010 documentary The 16th Man, have focused on specific events in his life. It has been argued that in Invictus and other films, the American film industry has played a significant part in the crafting of Mandela's global image. See also: List of peace activists.